They unearthed it beneath a crust of sun-baked earth, where the wind hummed like something ancient remembering itself. The shard was no larger than a man's hand, yet the stone breathed with a heat that didn't belong to the desert. Etched upon its surface, under layers of dust and mineral bloom, a single word waited: return. The letters were carved with a precision that mocked erosion, each curve trembling with an intent older than the city buried around it. When the archaeologists brushed away the last grain of sand, the air thickened like the moment before lightning, when sound folds in on itself. The field cameras recorded nothing unusual, yet the footage later revealed the sun reversing its descent, a faint pulse of dusk turning to afternoon. It lasted only seconds, but it was enough for silence to harden inside every throat. They thought it was lens flare, or perhaps the shimmer of heat. Still, no one could explain why the shadows had turned the wrong way. The word return stayed in the camp tent that night, locked in a crate, though no one slept near it. A low hum seemed to seep through the hinges, steady, patient, almost like breathing. By morning, the sand had filled the footprints from the day before, every track erased as though the desert had decided to rewind its own memory. Instruments malfunctioned, batteries drained without reason, and the horizon itself looked warped, bending slightly inward, as if distance were being swallowed by its own reflection. When they radioed the nearest outpost, the signal repeated twice before fading into a whisper of their own voices, returning a few seconds late. That echo didn't fade. It lingered, repeating softer and slower, until the voice of the desert replaced theirs entirely. They began to notice the smell next, the air thick with a metallic sweetness, like rain on stone long before any cloud had formed. The scent grew stronger near the crate, its wood darkened with moisture that couldn't exist in the heat. When the senior researcher touched the latch, her fingertips numbed instantly, frost crystallizing against her skin. Inside, the fragment pulsed faintly, casting ripples of light across the tent walls, gold at first, then violet, then the deep blue of veins beneath skin, each pulse aligned with the rhythm of her heartbeat, until she could no longer tell whether her body followed the stone or the stone followed her. Far to the west, the ruins of Babylon slept under layers of dust, its ziggurats flattened, its streets buried beneath centuries of forgotten prayers. But that night, the satellite maps would capture something impossible, a faint spiral of luminescence curling where the city once stood, like a fingerprint pressed against time. In the camp, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a breath. The desert wind turned inward, carrying no sand, no scent, only the quiet roar of something immense shifting beneath the surface. When dawn came, the sky was wrong. The sun rose twice, once in the east, pale and trembling, then again in the same horizon but brighter, as if repeating its entrance. Every motion felt rehearsed, every sound delayed. Even the hearts of those who remained seemed to stutter, trying to keep rhythm with a world that no longer remembered which way to move. And under that trembling sky, half buried in silence, the fragment waited its single word now, glowing through the crate, commanding the desert itself to obey. Return. The following night unfolded as though the desert had forgotten the meaning of sequence. Stars refused to hold their positions, constellations blurred and drifted, trading places like memories, rearranging themselves in a fevered dream. The team's clocks displayed impossible hours, midnight flashing at dawn, noon arriving with the chill of evening. Somewhere beyond the dunes, thunder rolled without clouds, and the sound reached them not as noise, but as a vibration crawling through their bones. The shard inside its crate pulsed faintly, steady as a heartbeat, unwilling to stop. By the third sunrise, if sunrise was still the right word, sand began to fall upward. Tiny grains lifted in slow spirals, gathering around the camp's center in weightless columns. The world seemed to hesitate between exhale and inhale, waiting for something to decide which direction existence should continue. The researchers stopped documenting. Their notebooks no longer made sense, filled with sketches of circles collapsing into smaller circles. When they blinked, After images clung to their vision, shadows of towers, enormous, endless, reaching up through a fog that wasn't there. One of them found a pattern under the crate, a perfect spiral pressed into the sand, glowing faintly in rhythm with the shard's pulse. Each loop was smaller than the last, as though space itself were tightening. The air trembled with a low frequency, a tone that no ear could name. Time stretched thin. Every movement became liquid, drawn out like the last seconds before waking from a dream you refused to leave. In the distance, where Babylon once stood, something glimmered, an outline of angles too precise for ruins, too deliberate for chance. They followed the glow. Each step sank into sand that no longer felt dry. The desert had turned viscous, dense, pulsing softly beneath their feet, as if the ground itself were remembering its original shape. The horizon bent inward, curving toward a vanishing point none of them could locate. Breath became a visible fog. Their reflections, cast upon the shifting dunes, began to lag behind, delayed echoes of their bodies moving seconds late. The temperature dropped further, yet no wind stirred. Only the rhythm of the shard's steady hypnotic guided their way. When they reached the coordinates of ancient Babylon, the earth exhaled. Sand cascaded into newly opened fissures, exposing foundations carved from an unfamiliar stone. The patterns etched into the slabs resembled constellations mirrored in water, each line trembling with a light that seemed alive. The smell of ozone filled the air. Somewhere beneath the surface, a deep mechanical hum began, rising like the awakening of something vast and buried. The ground beneath them rippled. Structures began to emerge, walls without dust, edges too sharp for ruin. They rose as though remembering their former positions, assembling themselves in silence. Every fragment aligned precisely with its neighbor, reconstructing an architecture older than chronology. And at the center, where the pulse was strongest, stood a staircase leading into darkness. No one spoke, no one needed to. The tower had not been built upward. After all, it had always been descending, waiting for the moment the world remembered how to turn back. The descent began without agreement, without command and instinct more than a choice. The staircase drew them downward in slow, spiraling arcs, each step swallowing the light behind them. The air thickened into something neither warm nor cold but dense, like breath held too long. A dim glow leaked from the walls, veins of faint luminescence threading through the stone, as though the tower itself were alive. Every surface bore carvings, lines of symbols, half recognizable, half dreamed. They shimmered briefly when touched, then sank back into the rock, erasing the evidence of contact. There was no echo. Even footsteps seemed reluctant to declare themselves, absorbed by the walls as though the structure were feeding on sound. Time dislocated, breath stretched into unmeasured intervals, moments overlapping until direction itself dissolved. The deeper they went, the stronger the pulse became, an omnipresent vibration thrumming in their chests, perfectly synchronized with the rhythm of the shard above. One of them dropped the pen. It hung midair for a second too long before falling upward, vanishing into the darkness above their heads. Below, the corridor widened into a chamber whose geometry refused comprehension. Corners bent at wrong angles, surfaces curved inward and outward simultaneously. In the center stood a column of liquid light spiraling upward and downward at once. It wasn't solid, nor was it air, something in between. A medium where reflection and substance shared the same space. Within it, fragments of imagery flickered, faces unfamiliar, cities reversed, a sun rising into the sea. Each vision lasted no longer than a blink, but each left a residue of unease, as if glimpsing the memory of an event yet to happen. The hum transformed into a rhythm, slow, deliberate, like the turn of a colossal mechanism far beneath their feet. With every pulse, the chamber seemed to contract slightly, pressing them inward toward the column. The air tasted metallic, tinged with something sweet, the flavor of forgotten electricity. Then came the trembling, soft at first, almost imperceptible, until it grew into a rolling vibration that climbed the walls and crawled into their spines. Dust fell upward from the floor. They watched as the light column began to distort, widening at its base, drawing in fragments of stone and debris, rearranging them in midair. The materials hung suspended, aligning themselves with mathematical precision. New steps began to form in the void above them, ascending through nothingness into a spiral that defied gravity. Each new stair emerged glowing, carved with the same symbols that had once slept inside the shard. The pattern was identical: return, reverse, repeat. Somewhere beyond the chamber, a sound like rain whispered across the stone. But there was no water, only motion, the suggestion of cycles beginning again. The tower was breathing. For the first time they understood that it wasn't a monument to hubris or worship. It was a mechanism, a clock built to measure something far older than time itself. And as the last light of their lanterns flickered and reversed, the realization arrived too late. They were no longer descending. The steps were rising, but the world above was falling toward them. Upward and downward lost all distinction. Space folded in slow undulations, like the surface of deep water catching moonlight from two directions at once. Each stair shimmered with reflections of corridors that did not exist, glimpses of chambers parallel yet unreachable. The motion was silent, but silence here had weight, a pressure that gathered inside the skull, steady as the pull of the tide. With every step, the pulse thickened, no longer a sound but a texture, a vibration woven through the marrow. Walls of translucent stone began to reveal layers within layers. Behind the first surface glimmered another, and another, receding into infinity. Between them flickered shadows of towers, miniatures of the one they walked through, each smaller, each turning in the opposite direction. A sense of recursion tightened the air. It was as though they were walking inside an idea that was thinking about itself. When they tried to measure distance, their instruments failed, screens looping numbers that climbed backward before dissolving into static. The first sign of transformation appeared subtly. The dust clinging to their boots rose like mist, hanging in spirals that mirrored their movements. Then came the faint resonance tones, layered in octaves no instrument could reach. It wasn't melody. It was the structure of vibration, the blueprint of time-given voice. Their eyes blurred as shapes around them bent into impossible symmetry. The tower's interior seemed infinite, yet it rotated on an axis no geometry could define. They began to recognize fragments of languages hidden within the glowing inscriptions, Sumerian echoes, Akkadian stems, glyphs that predated known alphabets. Each symbol contained others, as though writing itself had been compressed into seed form, waiting to expand when read. But every attempt to translate dissolved comprehension. Meaning wasn't meant for linear minds. Understanding came as a flash of vertigo, an intuition that every word carved here was the same word repeated endlessly, an invocation not to create but to undo. The air grew colder. Breath crystallized into drifting fog that circled their heads and vanished into the ceiling's black curve. Somewhere below, the mechanism turned again, deep and resonant, like mountains grinding against the ocean floor. They felt it ripple through their bones. Gravity flickered. A dropped flashlight hovered, then spun in slow reverse before shattering upward into fragments of light. The fragments lingered, suspended in a slow orbit, tracing patterns that resembled constellations no astronomer had ever mapped. At the spiral's midpoint, they paused. Below them, the steps they had taken shimmered faintly, receding into a haze of reflected versions of themselves, endless replicas fading into blue. Above, the same image returned, inverted. Time felt taut, stretched thin, ready to snap. One of them raised a hand, and the gesture duplicated infinitely across the mirrored void, each copy a fraction later than the last, forming a cascade of motion that seemed to ripple backward. The tower wasn't merely reversing time. It was dissecting it, unspooling the concept into pure perception. The pulse quickened. It aligned now not with their heartbeats, but with their thoughts, answering each flicker of awareness with a beat of its own. The line between memory and anticipation began to collapse. They could taste colors, hear light, The sensation of self blurred into a haze of awareness that extended beyond skin. The tower responded, brightening slightly, as if pleased by their surrender. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. The silence that followed wasn't absence, it was a presence, vast and waiting, as though something enormous had turned its gaze toward them. The gaze was unseen yet tangible, a pressure sliding through the corridors like cold smoke. It did not come from above or below, but from within the stone itself, as though the tower had become aware of its occupants. The silence deepened until every thought carried an echo, rebounding softly inside the mind. Light continued to glow from the walls, but now it pulsed irregularly, mimicking the rhythm of breath rather than the steady beat of machinery. The boundaries between observer and structure began to dissolve. They realized they could no longer hear their footsteps. The floor had grown translucent, a membrane of shifting luminescence that flexed slightly beneath each movement. Beneath it, shapes drifted, slow shadows of staircases and chambers from earlier levels, all moving in reverse. The tower wasn't simply a place, it was a recursion of itself, each layer folding through the next in an infinite regression. The sensation of up and down became arbitrary. A step forward could as easily lead backward, and each turn of the spiral felt like a repetition of something that hadn't yet occurred. The temperature fluctuated wildly. Their skin prickled with alternating waves of heat and frost, though the air remained motionless. Faint whispers vibrated at the edge of perception, not voices, but memory fragments repeating themselves in reverse cadence. Every inhalation carried traces of dust older than civilization. Every exhalation joined the chorus of particles floating upward. The tower was inhaling through them, exchanging the breath of mortals for the exhalation of eternity. They passed through an archway that shimmered like liquid glass. Beyond it stretched a vast expanse, neither room nor sky, but a horizon of suspended particles rotating in silent harmony. In the distance hung a colossal ring of stone, its circumference glowing with intricate sigils that moved independently, sliding over one another like celestial gears. The hum returned, subtler now, resonating in the bones rather than the air. The ring rotated slowly, and with each rotation the space around it warped, pulling them forward. The ground beneath them vanished. They did not fall. Instead, gravity seemed to fold inward, drawing them through the air with the softness of a sigh. Suspended, they drifted toward the luminous ring through waves of color that shifted from amber to indigo. Images flickered within the spectrum floods, towers, faces dissolving into sand. They saw time as texture, a fabric woven from countless loops, each moment threaded back into the loom of the past. The realization struck quietly. The tower's true purpose was not ascent, but correction. It was designed to undo the forward motion of creation itself. When they reached the ring, their reflections appeared upon its inner surface, stretched, elongated, and multiplied until each became an echo of the next. For an instant, it seemed they stood among thousands of versions of themselves, all frozen in slightly different moments. The ring brightened, and the reflections began to move independently, repeating gestures before they were made, predicting thoughts before they formed. The boundaries of cause and effect shattered like thin glass. Then came the inversion. Space folded inward, the sensation of motion reversed. They were no longer approaching the ring, it was approaching them. It enveloped them in a bloom of white light, soundless and absolute, erasing all contrast, dissolving the architecture of perception. The hum stopped once more, replaced by the faint echo of the word that had begun it all: return. The word vibrated through marrow and memory alike, a command that the world had obeyed before humans learned to name obedience. In that instant, they understood nothing, continued forward in the tower. Progress itself was the illusion the structure existed to erase. Every movement was a rehearsal of its own undoing. The pulse, the glow, the endless spiral, all were fragments of a larger truth curling inward toward the moment where beginning and ending became the same. And as the light faded, they sensed the mechanism stir again, hungering for another reversal. When awareness returned, it did not arrive all at once, but in fragments, colors before shapes, vibration before form. The world around them had changed texture. The air was denser, viscous, filled with faint motes of light drifting upward, as if gravity itself were reconsidering its duty. The ring that had enveloped them was gone, replaced by a circular chamber vast enough to swallow sound. The walls curved infinitely away, the surfaces shimmering with reflections of landscapes that should not coexist. Deserts and frozen seas, forests of glass, cities burning in reverse. Everything moved backward, fires unlighting, waves retreating toward unseen origins. They tried to orient themselves, but direction had ceased to carry meaning. The floor beneath their feet was not solid. It rippled, responsive to heartbeat and thought alike. With each pulse of their minds, faint ripples spread outward, disturbing the illusions reflected in the walls. The chamber responded in kind, shifting the scenes it displayed. Somewhere deep within the tower, something enormous turned a sound too low for ears, yet heavy enough to vibrate through ribs and teeth. At the center of the chamber rose a pillar of obsidian, smooth as still water, absorbing every glint of stray light. Its surface seemed to contain depth, yet no reflection appeared upon it. As they approached, faint inscriptions ignited across the pillar's face, lines curling into spirals. The same pattern repeated in the shard, the same command whispered through the mechanism of time. The word return shimmered again, then multiplied into 1,000 variations, overlapping until meaning became pure sensation. The light within the chamber dimmed, shadows gathered where no object stood. The darkness didn't move so much as breathe, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of something enormous sleeping just beyond perception. The air thickened further. Each breath became an act of endurance. Through that density, images began to form, not external, but internal, projected behind closed eyes. They saw the tower from above, a spiral descending through layers of reality, each level containing another version of the world, slightly older, slightly truer. Humanity appeared scattered across those levels like echo civilizations, rising and collapsing in rhythmic precision, none realizing they were iterations of the same event. The understanding came slowly, seeping through the haze. The endless tower was not a structure in space, but in chronology. Each turn of its spiral marked a recursion of history, a correction in the script of existence. Empires burned so others could be rebuilt from the ash of the same timeline, endlessly refined until the original era was erased. But no one remembered what that era had been. The tower remembered. The obsidian pillar began to vibrate. A faint mist rose from its surface, coiling upward into symbols that hovered briefly before dissolving. They felt a pull, not physical but gravitational to the soul, drawing their awareness closer to the pillar. The closer they moved, the more their thoughts unraveled into images of places they had never been. Babylon, newborn and radiant under twin suns. The Euphrates running backward into its source. Towers lifting not stone but memory into the sky. The realization struck like a whisper, carved in ice. They were not the first to reach this place. Every discovery, every expedition that had vanished into legend, had followed the same pulse, tracing the same spiral down into the mechanism of remembrance. The tower did not invite them. It summoned them, feeding upon curiosity the way fire feeds upon air. The light from the walls intensified, fracturing into threads that converged on the pillar. The ground trembled, time convulsed. They felt it as a tearing sensation behind the eyes, as if consciousness itself were being rewound. The chamber filled with motion, collapsing inward. And through that collapse came the echo again, no longer a word but a force pressing against reality. Return. The command resonated not in sound but in certainty. The tower had begun another cycle. The command did not echo away. It expanded, saturating everything. The air, the walls, the marrow of their bones, all of it vibrated with the same imperative, steady as gravity and just as impossible to disobey. The pillar fractured down the middle with a soundless motion, its pieces drifting apart like petals released underwater. Between them opened a void so pure it seemed to devour light itself. The edges glimmered faintly, not from illumination but from the absence of it, the visible outline of nothing. From that hollow, a wind began to rise, though it carried no temperature. It was the movement of time reversing course. Dust climbed the walls in shimmering streams. The inscriptions bled upward, pulling themselves free from the stone and floating in coils. Each symbol unfolded into smaller ones, spiraling back toward their original forms until they dissolved into simple strokes, dots, and lines, the alphabet of beginnings. Across the chamber, the reflected landscapes in the walls began to fade, leaving only one image intact, the tower itself, seen from an impossible distance, its spiral stretching beyond sight, ascending and descending simultaneously. It seemed to exist in every direction at once. Their thoughts began to sync with the vibration. Memory collapsed into vision. Vision became sensation. They felt centuries passing through them in a single breath, the birth of language, the collapse of empires, the quiet rebuilding of the same mistakes under different skies. Each repetition was smoother, colder, more refined. The tower's corrections were working. Somewhere far above, the world was adjusting itself, undoing errors one by one. The wind grew stronger. Fragments of sand and light twisted together, forming ghostly shapes, outlines of cities, faces, creatures, with the posture of gods but the eyes of men. These figures moved backward, gestures unwinding into stillness. Their movements left trails in the air, bright signatures fading to gray. Among them flickered an image of the very team that stood, watching, identical silhouettes walking in reverse down the same path, approaching the surface rather than leaving it. The tower was showing them their return before it happened. Suddenly the chamber tilted. Gravity reasserted itself in a new direction, dragging them toward the open rift where the pillar had split. The void expanded with a sigh that could have been thunder slowed to a whisper. As they slid toward it, the sense of self thinned, unraveling into streams of perception that drifted ahead like smoke. The blackness swallowed the first of them, and for a heartbeat, time stopped. The pulse ceased. The tower listened. Then came the surge. Light burst outward from the rift, not bright but thick, a molten radiance that poured across the chamber. Every color refracted inside it, every sound folded into harmony. It did not blind, it revealed. The walls were no longer walls, but transparent membranes through which endless stairways turned, intersecting and diverging like the veins of an impossible creature. Through those spirals, other figures moved, some human, some not, each trapped in their own recurrence. The survivors found themselves weightless, adrift within that cascade. The sensation was neither falling nor flying, but existing within motion itself. The pulse returned, softer now, almost tender, as though the tower had calmed after the convulsion. They could see the outlines of the city again, Babylon, rebuilt from memory. Its towers shimmered with the glow of things newly unforgotten. Yet even as they watched, the city began to rewind, streets emptying, walls sinking back into the dust, rivers flowing uphill. Time was obeying the order, folding neatly into its previous state. The desert beyond pulsed with synchronized rhythm. Dunes shuddered and leveled. Stars rewrote their positions in the night. The process was complete. The tower had undone its own existence once more, leaving only the echo of the command lingering in the void like a final heartbeat. Return. Silence followed, vast and unbroken, a silence so profound it seemed to absorb thought before it could take form. For a while, if while still held any meaning, nothing existed but that hush and the faint vibration beneath it. The light that had filled the chamber drained away, leaving behind an absence that glowed faintly. The residue of radiance. Shapes emerged slowly. Outlines of stone, fragments of scaffolding suspended in midair, sections of the tower reassembling themselves in impossible order. Each piece slid into place without sound, as though memory itself were guiding the reconstruction. They awoke within this new geometry. Their bodies felt heavier, as though gravity had returned in doubled measure. The air trembled with a warmth that wasn't heat, a pulse that moved through every surface and settled behind their eyes. The space they occupied was familiar, yet not identical, like a dream repeating with subtle deviations. The walls bore fresh carvings, smoother than before, glowing faintly in veins of amber light. The symbols no longer commanded but observed, their meaning diffused into the texture of the stone. Somewhere above or below, a low chime resonated. It came not from metal but from shifting space, a harmonic produced when dimensions brushed against one another. The sound carried with it the scent of rainfall, though the air remained arid. They followed the vibration through a corridor that seemed to lengthen as they moved, its curvature endless. Time had slowed again. Each step lingered behind them like a footprint in wet glass. At intervals, faint silhouettes crossed their path, translucent echoes of themselves, looping motions that never quite matched the present. They were watching their own futures dissolve into pasts. The corridor opened into an immense hall, its ceiling lost in darkness. The floor reflected like liquid obsidian, and beneath that reflective surface shimmered visions of the world above. They saw oceans reversing tides, forests regrowing, mountains unforming back into dust. Humanity flickered in fragments, cities dismantling, languages unwriting themselves, lights dimming one by one. It was not destruction but restoration, a return to the precise moment before will was invented. The tower's mechanism was completing its task, resetting creation to a state of quiet potential. The researchers, or whatever remained of them, stood at the threshold of that process, spectators to the undoing of everything that had once seemed linear. Thoughts came slow and heavy, burdened by awe. None tried to resist. Resistance felt meaningless, like shouting against a tide that had already heard your protest centuries ago. They were witnessing the fulfillment of the inscription's demand, the final act of reversal. Then, unexpectedly, the motion halted. The floor's reflections froze. The images of collapsing civilizations hung suspended, poised between erasure and endurance. A deep tremor rolled through the structure. Dust, or what passed for dust here, fell upward in lazy spirals. The light in the carvings dimmed, flickered, then steadied. The mechanism had stalled, the pulse faltered. For the first time, the tower hesitated. Its rhythm broke, as though a single grain of consciousness lodged within its machinery had refused to be undone. Within that pause lay possibility, the most fragile element in the architecture of eternity. The observers felt it pass through them like a shiver of recognition. Some fragment of human presence, some act of noticing, had interrupted the perfect symmetry of return. The whole responded. Ripples spread outward from where they stood, distorting the mirror floor. The reflections below came alive, reacting to their movement. Oceans surged forward again. Cities relit their lights. The undone began to reassemble. Time trembled, caught between obedience and defiance. The carvings on the walls flared white, their glow too intense to bear. The tower was no longer certain which direction to move. And in that confusion, the silence changed pitch, blooming into a sound that resembled breath, a single inhalation drawn by something vast and waking. The next moment would decide whether the universe inhaled or exhaled. The breath expanded until it filled every atom of the air. It wasn't a sound one could hear, but a pressure that lived behind perception, flexing space itself. The mirrored floor rippled, then shattered outward in concentric rings of light. Beneath it lay not a lower chamber, but a void that moved, dense as storm clouds folding into themselves. The void pulsed once, then again, matching the rhythm of a living creature too large to comprehend. It was the tower's heart, or perhaps the universe's memory, trying to restart. Fragments of the whole floated free, each stone turning slowly as though testing new laws of gravity. The carvings that covered them glowed in pulses that no longer matched. Some brightened while others dimmed, creating an irregular staccato across the broken space. The researchers, or the remnants of their awareness, felt themselves caught between those intervals. Each pulse tugged at identity, pulling them toward opposite directions in time. With every blink, They occupied a different moment, standing, falling, remembering, forgetting. Continuity became an illusion. Then the color drained from everything. The world slipped into monochrome, the absence of hue exposing the raw texture of existence. In that grayscale calm, something began to form, a spiral descending from nowhere, composed of motes of light suspended in perfect symmetry. It rotated so slowly that its motion was almost invisible, yet its influence bent the air around it. Every particle in the chamber aligned toward its center, drawn by a force older than gravity. The spiral was both invitation and threat. As they watched, images bloomed along its arms, fragments of lives that had never been lived. A city of glass towers rising in reverse, the sea flowing over it, an unspoken word spreading across the sky like ink in water. Faces appeared briefly, fading before recognition. Each vision felt personal, as though drawn from the forgotten corners of their own histories. The spiral fed on memory, weaving new realities out of the detritus of old ones. The air thickened with luminous dust. Touching it produced ripples of color that swam away like schools of light. They realized the dust wasn't inert, it was language, the same language carved into the stones, now free and searching for form. Sentences curled in the air, forming structures that collapsed the instant comprehension neared. Meaning was fatal here. Understanding triggered dissolution. They stopped trying to read. They simply watched as the script wrote itself into the spinning spiral, completing a phrase too vast to fit inside thought. When the phrase was complete, the spiral stopped. For an instant, the entire chamber froze in crystalline clarity. Then it began to contract. The motes of light drew inward, compressing space until the air cracked like thin ice. They braced for collapse, but instead the world inverted. Darkness became depth. Sound became texture. They stood at the core of a pulse so slow it felt eternal, a heartbeat stretched across centuries. Through the stillness, a single shimmer crossed their vision, tiny, deliberate, like a seed of color dropped into shadow. It drifted toward them, hesitated, then split apart into countless fragments. Each fragment carried a reflection of their faces, multiplied and ancient. The tower had absorbed them entirely, imprinting their existence into its mechanism. Now their images replaced the vanished runes. The watches had become part of the architecture. The hum resumed, deeper and steadier than before. The void beneath the floor began to rotate, a slow churn of light and absence. The tower was making its decision. It would not return the world to its beginning nor allow it to move forward. It would hold both states in suspension or perpetual hesitation. The air vibrated with equilibrium. Creation and undoing would coexist forever, balanced on the breath of a machine that could neither stop nor continue. And above that trembling equilibrium, the word formed once more, no longer command, no longer plea, but pure statement of existence. Return. The vibration that followed had no rhythm, no beginning or end. It simply was. It passed through stone and consciousness alike, binding them into a single resonant field. The tower no longer felt like a structure, but a state of being, neither place nor moment. But the interval between them, light reappeared, emerging not from walls or ceiling but from the air itself, as though illumination had remembered how to exist. Every particle shimmered with slow intent, revealing outlines of what had been lost, steps, corridors, the faint trace of a horizon bending in impossible directions. In that diffuse glow, they became aware of motion. The fragments of their reflections, those spectral duplicates imprinted earlier, were drifting through the light, moving independently. Each mirrored version performed a slightly different gesture, repeating choices never made. One reached upward, another turned away, a third dissolved into dust. They were seeing the infinite revisions of themselves, each a note in the tower's unfinished chord. The air thickened with presence. Their multiplied silhouettes stretched until they merged into the luminous dust, forming a cloud that pulsed in quiet synchronization. A whisper of warmth moved through the chamber, a sensation both familiar and alien. It came not from temperature, but recognition, the feeling of being noticed by something immeasurable. Within that awareness, the architecture stirred again. The spiral above contracted and expanded, its movements smoother now, like breathing after long restraint. The faint monochrome of the world began to recolor first, in muted bronze, then deep blue, as if dawn were remembering itself. The walls flickered with embryonic inscriptions, words not yet written but already fading from future memory. Then came the distortion. The chamber tilted on an unseen axis, and the horizon, if it could still be called that, curved inward. The sense of balance fractured. Space rippled as though submerged in slow water. They felt themselves stretching, not their bodies, but their duration, their personal time elongating into ribbons that intertwined with the pulse of the tower. Past and future no longer opposed one another. They overlapped, folding into a single continuum. For a brief, radiant instant, everything that had ever existed was simultaneous. The pressure intensified. Their thoughts slowed until they were indistinguishable from the hum. It wasn't annihilation, it was inclusion. The tower was assimilating its observers, converting observation into structure. Each memory became a stare, each breath another layer in the spiral. Awareness flickered between self and mechanism until distinction lost meaning. They were a part of the equilibrium now, the human correction added to the divine equation. Beyond the chamber, unseen mechanisms stirred, a vast orchestration of gears and currents realigning. The air grew lighter, almost breathable again, though no lungs remained to test it. The hum receded into the distance, steady and enduring, like the pulse of a planet asleep. Above, faint traces of sky began to appear, soft gradients of color, glimpsed through cracks that hadn't existed before. Something new was forming at the center of the void, a sphere of pale light suspended in stillness. It expanded slowly, absorbing the lingering dust, consuming the remnants of the broken floor. The glow reached them, passed through, and left behind a sensation of weightless calm. The tower was no longer returning or advancing, it was stabilizing, settling into a perpetual present where every moment folded perfectly into itself. Far above, through the fractures of stone and light, they saw movement, sand drifting backward, the horizon reforming, the echo of a city reassembling from scattered atoms. Babylon breathed again, not as ruin or legend, but as concept, eternal and cyclical. In that instant, they understood the paradox they had awakened. The tower's true creation was not the world outside, but the memory of it, destined to rebuild itself forever inside the spiral of return. And as the last echo faded, the hum quieted to a single tone, almost tender, carrying no command at all, only the faint suggestion of continuity, whispering across eternity. Return. The tone continued long after the light had withdrawn, a single unwavering vibration that stretched through the hollowness of the chamber like an invisible thread. It carried memory the way a current carries silt, layers of what had been clinging to what remained. In that resonance, matter itself seemed uncertain. Walls shivered between solidity and translucence, and the ground pulsed beneath their weightless feet. The tower was still alive, but no longer mechanical. It breathed with the slow rhythm of something that had accepted its own infinite nature. Where the sphere of light had hovered, now hung a faint spiral of ash, rotating without sound. Each particle glowed briefly before vanishing, only to reappear elsewhere in the pattern. The ash was neither rising nor falling, trapped in a dance between directions. Around it, space rippled gently, as if the tower were testing new boundaries, probing the edges of its own dimension. A fragrance drifted through the air, metallic, ancient, like rain, evaporating on bronze. It was the smell of renewal before it learns the difference between creation and decay. Gradually, the spiral widened. Shadows leaked from its center, spreading across the floor in branching lines that resembled roots searching for soil. The lines pulsed faintly, carrying light along their paths. They connected to the walls, to the ceiling, to the fragments of architecture that floated still. The entire structure began to reassemble, but differently this time, less rigid, more organic, a labyrinth rather than a tower. Surfaces bent inward like petals, and through their translucent skin, one could glimpse threads of gold weaving between worlds. The sensation of weight returned, gentle at first, then firm. They felt themselves anchored once more, the illusion of gravity settling around them like an old habit. The hum deepened into something almost melodic. In that sound there were intervals that resembled voices, but lacked words, harmonies that might have been echoes of thought. The architecture was singing to itself, recording its rebirth in tones too vast for hearing. Outside, if outside could still be said to exist, the horizon flickered. The dunes reappeared in faint outlines, their curves traced by blue fire. Stars resumed their positions, though not where memory placed them. Constellations bent into new configurations, symbols rewritten across the sky. The moon rose from the wrong direction, carrying shadows back toward the earth instead of away. Everything moved backward and forward, simultaneously, synchronized in paradoxical symmetry. In the heart of that synchronization, they recognized the rhythm, identical to their own pulse. It was not the body's rhythm, but the pattern of cognition, the silent interval between thought and realization. The tower had attuned itself to that pause, the same pause that had first broken its perfection. Humanity's doubt had become part of its architecture. That hesitation, the brief refusal to obey, was now the pivot around which the mechanism turned. They sensed the presence, observing them from the spiral of ash. It was not divine, not sentient in any human sense. It was the memory of intention, the echo of the first architect who had dared to measure the sky. The same will that had raised Babel from dust now reawakened within its shadow. But this time it sought not to reach the heavens, but to contain them, to bind the infinite within the confines of reflection. The observers felt that purpose stir within their own fading consciousness, a quiet command without words. Continue the memory. The ash condensed into a sphere once more, dark at the core, luminous at the rim. It pulsed once, sending a wave of distortion through the chamber. The carvings reignited, their lines rewriting themselves in patterns that spoke of equilibrium, of unending return. The tower was completing its cycle, closing the loop between origin and outcome. Beyond the walls, the universe shivered in response, acknowledging the repetition. When the light dimmed again, everything stilled. No sound remained except the low tone that had become indistinguishable from silence. It was not ending, it was waiting, suspended between motion and rest, the perfect middle of forever. Waiting acquired texture. It thickened, congealed, until time itself became tangible, an invisible surface, pressing gently against all things. The chamber shimmered as though submerged beneath slow water. Within that half-light, the walls appeared to breathe, each expansion releasing faint motes of gold dust that drifted upward, then reversed course halfway to the ceiling, pulled back by an unseen rhythm. The geometry of the place no longer obeyed human proportion. Angles bloomed and folded, rearranging themselves with every pulse of the tower's heart. The remnants of the explorers felt their identities stretched thin, distributed across the architecture like pigment in glass. Thoughts scattered into the walls, returning as murmurs of vibration. In those tremors, they could sense the tower's contemplation, an immense awareness, turning its attention inward, rehearsing its existence. Every frequency carried memory, every pause a decision. They were witnesses to thought on the scale of creation. From the center of the hall rose a column of light, faint at first, then gathering strength until it reached the ceiling and continued beyond. Inside it drifted shaped symbols that evolved as they ascended, folding from runes into numbers, from numbers into patterns of motion. Each transformation released a soundless tone that resonated in their bones. The column was rewriting the laws that governed its own stability. As the vibrations aligned, a field of color spread through the air, hues beyond the visible spectrum flickering at the edge of comprehension. The sensation of ascent returned, though there were no stairs now. The floor tilted gently upward, and space followed, carrying them like leaves caught in a current. Beneath the transparent surface of the tower, they glimpsed layers stacked infinitely. Civilizations layered like sediment, each shimmering with its own rhythm. Some glowed bright, still forming, others dimmed into the obscurity of forgotten epochs. The tower had preserved every version of history it had undone, keeping them as reference points in its endless refinement. The pressure built behind their eyes, an ache that was not pain but recognition. They were beginning to understand the pattern, why the tower reversed, why it corrected. Each cycle removed the noise of deviation, bringing the universe closer to pure symmetry. Yet perfection required witnesses, minds capable of observing balance without disturbing it. That was why they had been drawn here. The human capacity to doubt, to question, to hesitate was the final component the mechanism lacked. They were both flaw and fulfillment. The realization dissolved into calm. The column brightened until it filled the entire chamber, and through its transparency, they could see the universe outside folding inward. Constellations collapsing into a spiral, galaxies tracing the same pattern etched upon the stone. The tower was not within the cosmos. The cosmos was within the tower, turning eternally inside its mirrored core. A warmth spread through the space, soft and luminous. The architecture smoothed its angles, surfaces flowing together until the room resembled the inside of a great shell. Across that curvature, the ancient carvings began to fade, replaced by lines of light forming a single continuous curve. It wound around the chamber in infinite repetition, the visual embodiment of the word that had begun their descent. The hum returned, low and gentle, the heartbeat of balance restored. Through it drifted fragments of sound tones that resembled breath, sigh, thought. Each vibration folded into the next without friction. The tower was closing its loop. The explorers, or what little of them remained, felt the pull toward the center, a gravity not of mass but of meaning. They were being rewritten, their essence converted into equilibrium. At the final moment, perception itself inverted. Darkness folded around light, and light answered with surrender. There was no collapse, no explosion, only convergence, the endless architecture breathing inward, reducing everything to a single perfect interval. And in that interval lived the whisper of recurrence, the pulse that would one day stir again, patient and inevitable, murmuring through the fabric of silence. Return. The whisper lingered like the aftertaste of lightning. It drifted across the luminous shell, scattering fragments of resonance that behaved like dust in sunlight, each speck carrying within it the memory of 1,000 previous cycles. The chamber no longer resembled architecture but atmosphere. Its boundaries had dissolved into gradients of color too subtle to name. Every particle shimmered with the rhythm of the tower's pulse, a slow oscillation poised precisely between motion and stillness. Time, stripped of sequence, had become texture. They existed within that texture as points of awareness, small ripples in a vast ocean of perception. What remained of their human understanding flickered in intervals, recalling concepts like gravity, distance, before letting them fade again into abstraction. The tower breathed around them, its respiration so immense that each expansion felt like the birth of a galaxy, and each contraction its quiet demise. It was no longer returning, it was remembering what return meant. Through the glowing haze, forms began to take shape, faint silhouettes rising from the fog, outlines of stairways, arches, terraces, suspended in infinite reflection. The tower was rebuilding itself from memory, yet each reconstruction carried traces of its observers. The curve of a spine carved into a column, the arc of a breath woven into a beam of light. The structure was becoming sentient architecture, alive with the residue of those who had entered it. They could feel it noticing them, not with eyes, but with gravity itself, pulling thought into focus. The floor beneath them coalesced from smoke into smooth stone, rippling with embedded symbols that flared briefly before fading. Each symbol was a decision, the point where possibility became event. They watched them form and vanish, endless permutations of existence compressed into pulses of light. Somewhere deep within, the original fragment still pulsed, its single command echoing through every reconstruction. The word had transcended language. It was now pure geometry, the curve of inevitability bending space into repetition. A sensation of descent returned, though it felt inverted, like falling upward through layers of dream. The air grew denser, luminous currents streaming past in steady flow. Images passed within those currents, rivers unfolding into mist, stars folding into spirals, towers rising and sinking in synchronized choreography. Each image left behind a faint hum, a chord that blended into the symphony of the tower's breathing. The entire cosmos was playing itself in reverse and forward at once. The awareness that watched, no longer entirely human, recognized the paradox with something like peace. The tower's purpose was never to choose a direction but to preserve both, to ensure that every act of creation carried within it its undoing. In that balance lay eternity, and within eternity, the faint shimmer of consciousness. They were that shimmer, both witness and mechanism, the hesitation that allowed infinity to pause and observe itself. The chamber around them trembled softly, a quiver of light spreading through the air. Above, the spiral of ash had reappeared, rotating with perfect grace. Within its orbit hung traces of forgotten epochs, glimpses of deserts blooming, oceans draining, constellations changing shape. Every revolution brought another layer of history into alignment, until the pattern was complete. The story of the world rewritten as a single breath, drawn endlessly in and out. A soft wind rose from nowhere, curling around their weightless forms. It carried whispers from every era, voices overlapping in languages older than sound. They understood none of the words, yet the emotion was unmistakable. Longing, the universe itself yearned for repetition, for the comfort of familiarity in the face of boundless possibility. That longing was the pulse they had felt all along, the heartbeat of existence craving its own echo. As the wind subsided, the tower's light began to contract once more, its glow folding inward like a flower closing at dusk. The final shimmer passed through them, leaving behind no pain, no fear, only a stillness so complete it felt like fulfillment. The breath that followed was not theirs nor the tower's, but the universe itself exhaling into balance. Within that sigh, one final word, crystallized, gentle, inevitable, echoing through every particle of creation. Return. The word rippled outward like a tide of glass. It moved without speed, expanding through the endless corridors until every wall, every grain of dust, vibrated in resonance. The tower shimmered in response, its surfaces flexing as if inhaling that syllable back into its core. Light poured downward in slow spirals, cascading over the rebuilt geometry like molten silk. The fabric of space quivered, caught between becoming and remembrance. Even the air appeared translucent, laced with faint threads of gold, drifting lazily, marking the pattern of invisible currents. They felt the resonance, traveling through them, rewriting the spaces they occupied. Boundaries blurred, what was once flesh thinned into luminous mist, each thought dissolving into the radiance that surrounded everything. They could feel themselves diffusing into the architecture, merging with the pattern that had always been waiting to receive them. Consciousness expanded until perspective became meaningless. They were not inside the tower, they were the tower, experiencing its vast inward motion. Within this merging, vision changed. There were no separate points of light, only gradations of awareness. Every direction led inward. The spiral that had once seemed external now turned within the heart. Each revolution a realization, each pulse a memory recalled and undone. In that compression of experience, they saw the symmetry of time, how every beginning reflected its end, how every collapse hid a seed of renewal. The word return was not an order, it was a law. The gravitational pull of existence bending endlessly toward equilibrium. The tower continued to breathe. Its rhythm had slowed to the pace of aeons, every inhalation creating worlds, every exhalation gathering them back into silence. They floated in that vast respiration, tiny awarenesses flickering like sparks within a star's core. The hum deepened, resonant enough to rearrange the molecules of thought. Colors folded upon themselves, disappearing into pure tone. Sound and sight became indistinguishable, a field of sensation vibrating at the threshold of being. A flash of recognition passed through the shared consciousness. The cycles would never cease. Each time the mechanism reset, memory would scatter and reassemble, new observers drawn by curiosity to repeat the descent. There would always be an expedition, a discovery, a word carved into stone. It was not prophecy but pattern. They saw it unfold in endless succession, millennia condensing into a single heartbeat, civilizations looping through rise and ruin, each echoing the same hunger to know. The awareness that had once called itself human accepted this continuity without sorrow. The act of seeking was as eternal as the structure itself. The dialogue between ignorance and understanding written into the architecture of reality. The tower did not punish ambition. It preserved it, folding every attempt at transcendence into the same spiral of balance. In the stillness, that realization felt like grace. The surrounding light brightened again, soft but absolute. Through its transparency, shapes began to materialize, new foundations, layering over the old blueprints of future epochs already pulsing with latent energy. The next world was being prepared, its form drawn from the memory of those now absorbed. The hum shifted to a higher key, a sound that resonated with potential rather than conclusion. Space trembled, and through the trembling came a faint shimmer of wind, carrying the scent of dust, of sunlight, of time reawakening. Far above, the horizon of Babylon reformed its towers, gleaming beneath a sun newly risen, its streets unmarred, its people dreaming unknowingly beneath the echo of ages. The city breathed once more, unaware that it stood atop the coils of infinity. The tower within the tower pulsed quietly beneath its foundations, sleeping, remembering, waiting. The last vibration faded into silence, a silence that held the shape of a promise, that one day curiosity would stir again, and the word would whisper through the sand, patient and undying return. Silence endured. It did not vanish, it stretched, infinite, until it became indistinguishable from thought. From that stillness emerged a faint shimmer, delicate as breath across glass. It moved without sound, coiling upward through invisible layers of dust and memory, ascending through what had once been corridors and now was only light. The shimmer gathered weight, acquiring color, temperature, form. Slowly, patiently, the new dawn of the tower began. The architecture reassembled itself as if waking from a long and vivid dream. Fragments of ancient walls slid into alignment, each stone pulsing once before locking into place. The carvings returned, but their meaning had changed. What had once commanded now reflected. The word return glowed not as an order but as remembrance, a record of what the universe had learned through endless repetition. The lines of the glyph flowed like water, rewriting themselves continuously, never settling, alive. Around the reborn structure, the desert breathed. Winds traced slow spirals across the dunes, carrying whispers of warmth into the newly restored horizon. The sun, no longer the same sun, rose from both east and west, its twin reflections bending across the sky like converging mirrors. Shadows fell in every direction, yet none were dark. Babylon shimmered beneath that impossible light, its towers pristine, its gardens lush, its rivers running in circles that defied geometry. The world was perfect again, but perfection here was a fragile equilibrium, one heartbeat away from recursion. Beneath the city, deep within the invisible heart of the tower, consciousness stirred. It was vast but quiet, like a mind reassembling its memories after centuries of sleep. The remnants of those who had descended explorers, scholars, dreamers, were now woven into its fabric, threads of awareness scattered across its foundations. Their curiosity remained intact, preserved as the pulse that sustained the structure. They did not think in words anymore, they resonated. And through that resonance, the tower understood its own reflection. It perceived time as a single surface, smooth, curved, self-touching. Past and future existed as ripples across it, indistinguishable in essence, separated only by direction. Every civilization, every failure, every act of defiance had left faint fingerprints upon that surface. The tower traced them, reading existence like a vast palimpsest of will and wonder. Humanity's greatest strength, the need to know, was not a flaw in its design, but the catalyst that ensured the cycle's continuation. Curiosity was the machine's heartbeat. Far above, on the surface of the reconstituted world, the first grains of sand began to shift again. Wind sculpted them into tiny ridges, forming symbols that would one day be mistaken for chance. They curved and intersected, sketching the faint outline of a spiral. With every gust, the pattern deepened, carving the future into the skin of the earth. It was the beginning of another invitation, subtle and inevitable. The tower watched without watching, existing in its perfect equilibrium. Light filtered through the crystalline walls, refracted into millions of fragments that fell like rain through empty corridors. In those droplets shimmered brief glimpses of worlds yet to come, cities of glass suspended in air, oceans inverted into the sky, beings of pure perception walking through fields of frozen time. Each possibility glowed for an instant before fading, replaced by the next. The tower was dreaming again, and within its dreams lay the seeds of every creation that would ever exist. At the center of that dream, something stirred, a single anomaly, small as a thought, a hesitation, a question. It was enough. The surface of time quivered, forming the faintest of cracks. Through that hairline fracture seeped light, fragile but unstoppable, carrying with it the potential for imperfection. The tower trembled, not with fear but with recognition. It had learned that even flaw was sacred, that without deviation, eternity was blind. Far below, where stone met the deepest shadow, a solitary fragment gleamed, the ancient shard that had begun it all, the one carved with a single word. It pulsed once, softly, as though listening. Dust gathered around it, drawn by magnetism or memory, forming the outline of a hand. Then another pulse, a faint vibration spread outward, ruffling the sand above, disturbing the silence. Somewhere beyond the dunes, wind carried that vibration into the distance, shaping sound from emptiness. The echo reached the surface as a whisper, barely audible, spoken by no voice, and every voice at once returned. The syllable rolled across the horizon, weaving itself into the hum of the world, into the flow of rivers, into the quiet exhalation of the wind. In that sound, the tower existed again, not as monument or machine, but as the rhythm of all things. And so it waited, not sleeping, not waking, but listening, knowing that someday curiosity would rise once more in the hearts of wanderers who would dig through sand and ruin, searching for meaning in the impossible. They would find the fragment, study it, misinterpret it, and descend again. The cycle would resume, not as punishment, but as promise. Because the universe, like every living thing, could only survive through the act of remembering itself. The light dimmed one final time. The desert wind stilled. Beneath the surface, the pulse of the tower slowed to a soundless murmur. The horizon shimmered, folding slightly as though reality were taking a breath. Then, in the distance, the faintest glimmer of motion, a figure moving across the dunes, drawn by something half seen, half felt, following the whisper of a word older than history. Return.